melt is when I'm ocean waves.
Today on UVA Legends podcast, I have my old pal Todd Pooser, who we shared the first floor on a UVA dorm back in the fall of 1984. Todd is the CEO of the Virtual Commonwealth, which is going to help us work together to sustain the planet, which we'll get to. Todd, great to see you again. Thanks for doing this.
Julian, it's so glad. It's so great to see you again, and I can't tell you how much I appreciate you having me on this podcast. And I'm really looking forward to having a conversation and talk about how we can make the world a better place for everybody.
Well, thanks. It was great to talk to you too. I was a big fan of your YouTube channel, Save the Planet, the dive bar tour.
Sure.
People should tune in. All the episodes are great. The first episode may be some of the best 5 minutes you'll spend on YouTube. So I do recommend you do that. I know you've been, thinking of ideas which to save the world. In that series, your structure was pretty bold in terms of raising taxes on the very wealthy, in terms of providing health care from the government, things that I would love. Things are a little bit harder to get by in our government system. This mechanism, this vehicle, seems to be more of things that we can do, that we can choose to do. So you're taking a different tact. Why don't you just go ahead as we get started? Just go ahead and bottom line what the Virtual Commonwealth is and what you're trying to accomplish.
Yeah, I think the best way to lead into the Virtual Commonwealth is to actually talk about my book out of which all these ideas came, right? So one of the things that I've really devoted a big chunk of my adult life to is answering this question: how do we as human beings, how do we figure out a way to live in the best possible world given the conditions of our existence? And I've written a book where I've used science to advance a very comprehensive set of social policies that will achieve environmental sustainability and achieve social equity. I've been fortunate enough to have this book published as part of a series on public administration and social equity. Professor Richard Johnson at the University of San Francisco is curating this series, and it's out of this book that the ideas that underpin the Virtual Commonwealth come out of, and the whole idea is to use science as a basis to advance social policy, so that it's not just political opinion. This is something that we can empirically prove as a moral imperative. And I'm gonna kind of start off with things before we get into the Virtual Commonwealth. I'm going to start off with an example of how we can use scientific models to formulate social policy. And this is something you and I have talked about before, but it's something that appeals to people, and I think it's worth us leading into the discussion of the Virtual Commonwealth on. So if you remember, you and I talked about one time, there's something called CIPA, C-I-P-A. Remember that? You and I were talking about that? Congenital insensitivity to pain with anhidrosis. And that's actually a condition where kids are born without the ability to feel pain. And, some people actually say, well, that must be great, not being able to feel pain. And in fact, it's not very good at all. A lot of these kids die very young, and a lot more have to contend with ongoing medical issues, serious medical issues, because of the fact that they don't know when they've hurt themselves. Now, human society as a living system, and that's what it is. Human society is a macro living system. Human society has a form of CIPA. The true cost to the system of a gallon of gasoline is not $2 or $3 or $4 or $5. The true cost to the system of a cheeseburger is not 99 cents. But the price of a gallon of gasoline is $3 or $4 or $5, and the price of a cheeseburger is 99 cents in a lot of cases. And so just like the kid with CIPA doesn't pull his hand off a hot stove, we're buying as many gallons of gasoline, as many cheeseburgers as we feel like having, without directly and immediately feeling the negative pain, the negative impact, the pain that these things are causing us. And if we're going to live happily ever after, if we're going to achieve environmental sustainability and social equity, what we have to do is we have to create a society where we reconcile price and cost. And this is one of the fundamental principles upon which the Virtual Commonwealth is founded. Now, the next step in this kind of discussion is what I call the Cool Ranch Doritos example. I like Cool Ranch Doritos. A lot of people like Cool Ranch Doritos, right? I know that Cool Ranch Doritos aren't good for me when I eat them. The thing is that Cool Ranch Doritos aren't good for you when I eat them. Cool Ranch Doritos, in an ideal world, Cool Ranch Doritos are not made from organic ingredients. So in an ideal world, what we would have is we'd have a little bit of an incremental offset tax, an agriculture offset tax that would then be used to subsidize organic agriculture, right? Cool Ranch Doritos are processed food. Processed food takes energy. We don't need to process food in order to eat it. It's wasted energy, right? The food that comes out of the ground is perfectly fine to eat, but in order to process food, you need energy. And so in an ideal world, when you buy a bag of Cool Ranch Doritos, there'd be a little bit of an energy offset tax. And that would go to fund energy efficiency and clean renewable energy. Cool Ranch Doritos are transported to your store using trucks that run on highways. This is a really interesting thing that I've really dug into deeply recently, Julian, and this is something, where I want to tell a little bit of a story. An automobile-based mass transit system is not only horrible it's catastrophic from an environmental standpoint, it's even worse from a social equity standpoint. So let's take transportation, let's take suburban. What happens when you have an automobile-based mass transit system is that cities grow out rather than up. Okay, well, the incremental cost of suburbanization goes up over time because you have to build new roads and maintain existing roads, right? You have to pump electricity and water out to the middle of nowhere. I mean, when you turn on your tap, for example, where do you think that water comes from? We don't live in the ancient Roman Empire where there's this elegantly engineered aqueduct that slopes gently down from the mountains and leverages the force of gravity to bring water into the fountain in the town square. We pump our water out. That costs energy. That's an environmental impact. So there's all these factors that cause a automobile-based mass transit system and suburbanization to be just horrible from an environmental standpoint. And you know what, Julian? It's even worse from a social equity standpoint. I don't know, I don't want to assume that you don't know what redlining is. I'm sure you do, right? Redlining is this, when we started developing suburbs, the developers were given favorable government loans to build these suburbs with the tacit agreement that they would be sold to people that look like me and not people that look like you, right? Suburbanization has caused the segregation of American society since World War II. That's something that and there's a cost to that. And I can tell you a story here. This gets back to the Save the World dive bar story because as you mentioned, I've been a bartender here and there for quite some time, and even though I've lived in New York City since 1995, there was a period there after the 2008-2009 economic meltdown where I found myself in Princeton, New Jersey, and I was kind of regrouping and getting myself together for my eventual return to New York City. And during that time in Princeton, New Jersey, I picked up a few bartending shifts in the town of Princeton. And I worked at what was a self-proclaimed bistro where residences of the various satellite bedroom communities around Princeton would come in after work and they would have dinner. They were not Princeton University professors by any means. They were they were senior vice presidents of pharmaceutical companies and SC Johnson Wax and things like that. And I can remember pulling a shift one time where these two people came in. It was a slow night. So this couple came in and they sat at the bar, and because it was a slow night, I knew I was going to have to talk to them, right? And at some juncture, you just look for things to make a connection to people with, right? And they were wearing kind of his and her University of Michigan T-shirts, and it was nowhere as cute as I think they intended, but they seemed like a perfectly nice couple. And I've known people from University of Michigan. They seemed very nice, in the people I had met before, and they seemed reasonably intelligent. So I figured, hey, listen, They're from the University of Michigan. I went to the University of Virginia. These are both decent public schools, right? I'm trying to make a connection here. And so I'm having a conversation with them. And you're just looking for something to connect with these people, right? And so we started talking about our various college experiences, and we kind of got into a conversation. And I said, and this was something that I had just learned at the time, and I don't know if you know this, but it wasn't until 1970 that the University of Virginia allowed women to attend. Did you know that?
Yeah, and black students were right about the same time.
Well, that's that. So I said, I can't believe that. You know, this is something I had recently found out. This is, you know, don't forget, let's just take a step back and realize that this is a state school that didn't allow women until 1970,
Yeah.
right?
That was only 14 years before we started.
That's only 14 years before we started, right? And then I said right afterwards to this couple, I said, I couldn't believe that. But what I really couldn't believe was that despite the fact that Brown versus the Board of Education was in 1954, that Virginia public schools, meaning elementary and middle and high schools, weren't integrated until 1970, which is, again, 16 years after the Supreme Court decision. Apparently, in 1970, the powers that be in Virginia said, they just threw in the towel and said, we're just going to let everybody in at this point, right? And immediately after I said that part about the desegregation of Virginia public schools, Mr. and Mrs. University of Michigan said quite matter-of-factly, yeah, you know, U.S. public schools should have never been desegregated. People should just keep to their own kind. And I have to tell you, you know me well enough that to render me speechless is not an easy thing. I had never heard that before, Julie. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. You know, I graduated from high school in Virginia, and I went to college in Virginia. My dad's side of the family is from the deep South. They're from the panhandle of Florida, and I had never heard somebody quite matter-of-factly say U.S. public schools should never be desegregated. And the interesting thing is that Princeton, New Jersey is seemingly a nice little town. It's 15 miles up the road from Trenton, New Jersey. And this couple from the University of Michigan began to tell me about how the people in Trenton, New Jersey were just different. They were a different type of people, right? They weren't like us, and they proceeded to attribute any number of social ills to this other, right? And I can't help believe that in addition to the negative environmental impact of suburbanization and an automobile-based mass transit system, and in addition to the outright implicit and explicit racism that suburbanization embodies, there's this lack of community. There's this physical separation, which has caused a lack of empathy, and it's caused a willingness to scapegoat that would not otherwise be present if we didn't have this physical separation. And I can kind of tell a little bit of a happy ending to that story, in that when I finally made it back from Princeton back into New York City, not about 10 years ago, you know, when you come back to a place like New York City and you've been away for a while, you notice things that you appreciate that it wasn't until you were gone that you appreciated them, right? And you and I are the same age, and I can tell you that you know, Sesame Street debuted the day before my third birthday in 1969. November 10th, 1969 is when Sesame Street debuted. And I think we can everybody who's of our generation can remember that Sesame Street made a pretty good point of showing little Black and brown and white kids being together, and they showed this as a natural phenomena, and that was right, and it was just, and it was the proper thing to do. And I can remember, even when I was a kid, thinking that even though I didn't have a problem with this, that even though I didn't have a word for it, it seemed a little contrived, right? It didn't really necessarily reflect the world that I lived in. But when I got back from Princeton, and I was walking around the streets of New York, I can remember on the corner of 92nd and Amsterdam, um, there were these three guys who would hang out on their breaks, and there was a black guy who worked at the pet store, and there was a guy from Pakistan who was a doorman at one of the apartment buildings, and there was an Asian guy who owned the bodega, and they would stand on the corner and they would smoke cigarettes and talk about, I don't care what they talked about. They were talking about something. They were friendly. This was not contrived, right? This is a physical closeness that I think it's not coincidental that it took place in an urban area and not it's not a situation that could have taken place in a suburban area. So back to the Doritos example is that we have all these costs related to the way we transport ourselves and transport our goods. And so just like there would be an incremental agriculture offset tax because Doritos are not made from organic ingredients, and just as there was an incremental offset tax for energy because it's processed food, there would be an incremental transportation tax that would be used to then fund mass transit within cities and between cities.
I think what's underpinning the story with the University of Michigan people in the bar was the interdependence. If there's no interdependence of community, then the costs to someone else aren't felt by the people who are incurring the cost.
Absolutely.
So that's the problem with the us and them. If we don't feel like if the poor community they can't get to their jobs or it's more expensive because there's no public transportation, all the things that can benefit us as a community. If the people who are making the expenditures don't feel it, then they're not going to make the right decisions in the community interest.
Absolutely. You know, and this is the whole thing is that when we talk about SEPA and we talk about putting all these offset taxes together, what we're really talking about is information feedback systems, right? And one of the things you touched upon, which I bring up, quite often, especially when we talk about scientific models providing the basis for social policy, is that you can prove very easily, very quickly, that all of life is interdependent. Mm-hmm. There's no meaningful or useful distinction to be drawn between environmental health and human health. And there's also something, and this is something that I put into the Save the World Dive Bar tour, which is there's no such thing as them. I can empirically prove to you that we are our brothers and sisters keepers. And just for context, I'm an atheist. This is not religious dogma for me. This is scientific biological fact. Just as your kidneys can't live without your lungs, and your lungs can't live without your kidneys, you and I are both part of the same living organism. And so it's in my best interest that you have health insurance, and it's your best interest that my kid knows how to read and write, and it's in everybody's best interest that we all have something to eat, right? So and people will often stop you at that point and say, well that sounds like socialism, doesn't it? Well, you know what I say about that is, well, we're all socialists. It's just some of us choose to admit it.
Yeah.
You know what's socialist? Here's what's socialist. The fire department's socialist.
Yeah.
Right? The municipality owns the fire trucks. The municipality owns the equipment. The municipality pays the salaries. Well, owned and operated by the government is pretty much the dictionary definition of socialism. Now, do you know why the fire department is socialist? The fire department's socialist because when one house catches fire, it doesn't burn down just one house. It burns down a bunch of houses. Yeah. So it's therefore in your best interest that your neighbor has the protection of a fire department, and it's in your neighbor's best interest that you have the protection of the fire department. Whenever we start talking about terms like this and people throw down the socialist tag, it's code.
Yeah.
It's code. The code is, when you say something socialist, the code is, I have abdicated moral responsibility for the direction of our society. It's code for I've got mine, and if you don't have yours, that's your problem.
Right.
And there's not a scintilla of empirical evidence to support that that's actually true.
And it's like the development of the internet or the farm subsidies. There's so many ways the government invests in people. A lot of times they're already well off, and we don't consider that socialist. But before I don't want to run off all of our conservative listeners out there. But,
Yeah.
but I do want to. We talked a little bit about the why and the inspiration, and I think it's not hard to convince people that something needs to be done. But let's talk a little bit right now. Let's get a little bit more concrete about how it works, and that's what I think the brilliance of your model is. And I also think that it's a model that can be used in different ways. That you're using it in terms of sustainability. But there are so many different ways where we can improve society if we can empower people to make the investments on their own instead of waiting for government to do it. And I think
absolutely
that's where it breaks down. Even conservatives can get on board if people are investing their own money.
Absolutely, and I thank you for that segue. And just to wrap up the Cool Ranch Dorito example is that in an ideal world, every time we swiped our card, right, there would be this calculus going on in the background where we would trace every purchase, every component of every purchase from the point of sale back through the supply chain, and we would say, listen, this actually costs a lot more than we think it does, and we reallocate this, whether it's agriculture or energy or transportation or health. Because again, Cool Ranch Doritos are not healthy for you. Ultra processed foods cause cancer. They cause brain cancer. They cause ovarian cancer. So there would be this reallocation. There would be this offset that goes with every purchase, so that ultimately, when you buy a bag of Cool Ranch Doritos, it doesn't cost $2.99. It costs $4.99, and that money is then used. So when you go to a local farmer's market, a bunch of locally grown organic carrots doesn't cost $4, it costs 50 cents. And in this way, we collectively steer the political economy in a more sustainable manner. The fact of the matter is that practically speaking, this kind of ideal Cool Ranch Doritos scenario that I've laid out is not going to happen. It's just not politically viable. There's not enough impetus behind it. And so to the Virtual Commonwealth, which is this platform I've developed, is it really asks the somewhat rhetorical question is, why do we need anybody's permission to do this? Right? How do we take it upon ourselves to use our financial weight to do what we want, to build this kind of society that we want to happen? And what the Virtual Commonwealth is, it's a platform, it's an application where members, where citizens of the Virtual Commonwealth agree to offset their unsustainable purchases, and then that money is taken and it's used to crowdfund sustainable companies that are not only environmentally sustainable but have solid social equity policies, and the members of the Virtual Commonwealth then become equity partners in this. It's an investment fund. And in that way, we can ensure that this is a way for us to make sure that our principles are institutionalized in a manner that's one step removed from political whim. I mean, what's somebody going to do? The thought exercise is somebody says, well, listen, I think the Virtual Commonwealth is Marxist and leftist and it's un-American. And you know what you say to them? You say, well, then don't join. Mm-hmm. Right? Because me and everybody who believes like me, we're going to join and we're going to actually make this thing happen. And what are you going to do? Are you going to outlaw investment platforms? You're going to outlaw Charles Schwab? You're going to outlaw Robinhood? Well, that's not going to happen.
So have you gotten that blowback, a kind of a ideological, political blowback? Well, that's tree hugger stuff, because it seems to me it's empowering people to make their own choices. So
yeah,
it seems that it could be looked at as apolitical.
You know, it could be apolitical, but I have to tell you, one of the reasons that I was encouraged, self-encouragement, obviously, to develop this app is that when you look at the way I make my money is in digital marketing. So I'm very in tune to audience segmentation and targeting appropriate audiences with appropriate message. 70% of 18 to 34-year-olds in this country, 70%. This is not 51-49. 70% of the 18 to 34-year-olds in this country consider the environment to be a priority. And one doesn't blame them, because these are the folks who are going to have to deal with this impending environmental catastrophe. At the same time, this group investment in ESG investments has grown 10 times. It grew 10 times between 2015 and 2020. This group, 18 to 34-year-olds, invested $5 billion in 2015. They invested $50 billion in 2020. So this is a motivated target audience that wants to do something, that wants to make the world a better place. And as I've alluded to or outright mentioned before, we're not only a majority of the population from just a numbers standpoint, we're an even bigger majority from a financial standpoint. And so this is an empowerment move. This is what I call it's monetizing your environmental activism. It's weaponizing sustainable investment, so that, if somebody comes in and says, listen, we don't believe in this. We're not trying to lobby somebody to make this law. We're doing this on our own accord, and we're voluntarily paying these offsets, knowing, and this is another interesting distinction here, Julian, which is, you can go to these carbon calculators online, and you can enter in all of your details, and you say, listen, I've got 2 cars, and I live in a 4,000 square foot house in the suburbs, and this is how often I travel, and this is how much meat I eat, and they write and they say, okay, well, here's your carbon footprint, and you need to write a check for $136, and we're going to plant trees that'll offset your carbon footprint, right? So this idea of self-taxation is not new, and it's becoming ubiquitous. The difference between what I just described and what the Virtual Commonwealth is that we're not just writing a check and hoping that somebody plants trees. We're writing a check and saying, I'm going to actually have an equity position in this, and I'm going to benefit from my own altruism, right?
So you think I think it's easy to see where the investment can help the Commonwealth pick out companies that are doing things the right way, things that are going to sustain the planet. I think it's easy to see how that will happen. But do you also think it's going to be a moneymaker for those, a big moneymaker for those who make the investment?
Oh, absolutely. That's the whole point. Now, again, this is not a trading platform. I mean, I don't want people getting in there and expecting to make a buck in the first 3 months and then turn around and sell, and then you get out of there. That's what Robinhood's for. We're talking about people. You're going to want people to have a vest. They have to be vested, right? So for 2 years, you're just letting this money sit, and that's which is the purpose of investment anyway, right? Is that the idea is to give a company a stable capital base that they can use to then grow. So yeah, the whole idea here is I'm going to be doing the right thing, and I'm going to be rewarded financially for it. And eventually, when these companies either the public companies either grow bigger, or non-public companies actually turn public, then the members, the citizens of the Virtual Commonwealth, they're going to be financially rewarded for their social and environmental responsibility.
And you guys are going to the Commonwealth, and you are going to find the companies to invest in, or the companies are going to find you and try to convince you that they should be part of the Commonwealth. Well,
that's a really great question. So the way I envision this happening is a couple of things, because again, first of all, we're going to need a starting inventory of companies, and that's the Virtual Commonwealth, meaning me and my group of advisors and strategic partners are going to say, listen, these are the companies that have a clean environmental record, and they have a good record when it comes to social equity policies. But what I also envision is the members of the Virtual Commonwealth being able to vote there'll be 4 or 5 companies in the food and beverage vertical. There'll be 4 or 5 companies in the energy vertical. There'll be 4 or 5 companies in the apparel and clothing vertical. There'll be 4 or 5 companies in home furnishings and electronics. And what we want to do is, again, and what the Virtual Commonwealth really is, and this is something I just spoke about at a conference in Kansas City, which is the Virtual Commonwealth is a standalone platform that functions like a self-governing public entity, but it is in fact collectively privately owned. So it's not like we're going to be collectively deciding on who to crowdfund. We're going to be collectively deciding on who is in this network, right? And I appreciate the nuance of your question, which is this, and this is again coming from somebody who makes his living in advertising. This is something that I envision can change the nature of the brand consumer relationship, where consumers are not just consumers, they're investors, they're part owners. And every time, if you and I are citizens of the Virtual Commonwealth, and we've invested in Misfit Markets, for example. Misfit Markets is an organic fruit and produce company that takes produce that supermarkets would otherwise throw away, and they deliver it to your door. So there's a lot of waste in the system, and they're making the world a better place, and they're distributing organic. Every time you and I buy from Misfit Markets, if we're investors in Misfit Markets, then our equity goes up, now doesn't it?
Yeah.
Right. And so this is this idea of the Commonwealth, where we're all owners, we're all customers, and we're all collectively deciding how we want things to be.
And let's say it's wildly successful, and the Commonwealth makes money for the investors, and also we are making an impact in terms of sustainability, in terms of the products that are being purchased. It seems to me it would be a vehicle that can be copied by others. Would you see that as a win because others are doing things to help the sustainability of the earth, or would you see that as competition?
You know, at this point, I think that we're doing something that's unique enough that if we get enough of a head start, it's going to be very difficult. We're going to have a first mover advantage. Mm-hmm. But in the interest of the principle, I hope there is a competition for this. Right. You know what I'm saying? Is because when we talked about, Julian, when we talked about using science to, like, for example, empirically prove that we are our brothers and sisters keepers, for example. What that really reflects is the fact that truly healthy thought, and we're all specialized parts of this very complex interdependent whole, right? So what truly healthy thought and behavior is, it's neither selfish nor altruistic, but it's at the crossroads of self-interest and altruism. Mm-hmm. So I would love the Virtual Commonwealth to be a unicorn, and we got a first mover advantage, and we have 25 million people, not just in the United States, but in Canada and in Sweden and Nigeria and Singapore and Japan, all equity crowdfunding these wonderful companies. But if all it does is it kicks off a competition to exhaust that space, then I think that I can live with that as well, because the end goal here is to make sure, again, that we all live in the best possible world given the conditions of our existence. And you know, I'm not. I certainly want to make money for my fellow Virtual Commonwealth citizens, and I certainly want to make money for the Virtual Commonwealth investors. But I don't need to be a billionaire. You know, who needs to be a billionaire? I don't need to be a billionaire.
You can give it to your old pal Julian. Well, yeah. You know, but why you? So you worked for a public radio station in Seattle.
Yep.
As you said before, you spent most of your career, your paying job, your career is in digital advertising, and you've done quite well. You know, why is Todd Pooser the guy that's come up with this really unique idea vehicle with which, if it works, could show true promise. Why was it you? What about your background enabled you to come up with such a cool idea?
It's really, I have to tell you, as I was prepping for this podcast, Julian, I thought about that exact question. I'm really glad you asked it because you can remember right after you and I graduated from college, there was the Tiananmen Square protests, right? And I can remember after I graduated from college, I worked in our family business, and it wasn't particularly inspiring, but because of various factors, it was something that I felt I had to do. And I was sitting there one night watching the television, and I saw that guy standing in front of the tank, and I was like, "Wow, okay, this guy believes in something. This guy's making his mark, right?" And I sat back and I asked myself, what do I want to be able to say for myself 20 or 30 or 40 years from now? What do I want my contribution to be? And never one for half measures. I sat back and I asked myself what was the biggest problem I could possibly think of, and I figured out if I could come up with a solution to that, then that would be a life well spent, right? And the biggest problem I could possibly think of was, how do we all live in the best possible world given the conditions of our existence? And throughout my kind of money earning career, I won't even call it a professional career, because as I've mentioned, I am in digital marketing right now, but I've done a lot of bartending, and I've done a lot of this, and I've done a lot of that, but it's all been to kind of come up with this plan, and not just a plan of opinions, a plan of science. And it hasn't taken me 30 years. It hasn't taken me 30 years to master the subject matter. It's taken me 30 years to come up with the stories to best communicate the subject matter. So I have the SEPA story, and I have the Cool Ranch Doritos story, and I have the story about Mr. and Mrs. University of Michigan. What one of my favorite quotes is, Julian, is Miles Davis, and he said something that I've always loved, which was, sometimes you got to practice for a really long time just to be able to sound like yourself. And that's kind of where I am right now, is that I've spent a lot of time doing a lot of homework, and I feel like the time is right. Not just for myself personally, but all you got to do is look out the window. I mean, a month ago in New York City, it was orange because it was literally the sky was on fire. You know what I'm saying? It's time right now for these types of ideas, when we start realizing the interdependency of all living systems, and that has environmental implications, it has social implications. And again, as I've mentioned, I'm not a particularly religious man, and what I do know about some biblical stories is, the idea that the story of David Goliath isn't necessarily a story about the little guy beating the big guy. It was about how the little guy beat the big guy. And if I remember correctly, he threw the stone. He just didn't throw a stone at Goliath. He threw a stone at Goliath that hit at just the right place, at just the right time. And what I'm hoping is that these types of ideas, where we say, listen, we're not asking for anybody's permission, we're going to set up this investment platform, and we're going to do our own ESG program, we're going to do our own sustainability program, we're going to do our own social equity program, and hopefully that appeals to people, and it grows to its potential.
Well, and I mentioned this earlier, that somewhere your thought process took a pretty abrupt turn in your YouTube channel, which your YouTube series, Save the Planet, which I think is brilliant.
Mm-hmm.
You called for bold action, and I thought you were extremely persuasive in explaining why we need that action. But in this circumstance, your action is more voluntary. So you went from calling for bold action in a very persuasive way to now it's a very persuasive way of asking folks to do it on their own.
Yeah.
What happened to change your approach? Or maybe this was always the goal.
I mean, I think that's a really interesting question. And I think that you just get to the point where you realize you have to take a step back and say, well, listen, who's keeping us politically? Because let's face it, from a political standpoint, there are certain things that just aren't realistic, right? Um, and and a lot of sustainability policies are not realistic. And look how things are trending, for crying out, Julian. I mean, from a social equity standpoint, I mean, we've got the state of Florida that's they're 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 actually suggesting that slavery wasn't all bad because, I mean, it's surreal.
Yeah.
So obviously there's something that took place between the time I did the Save the World Dive Board tour now, because it's just gotten too bizarre. And but getting back to the answer to the question is that the folks standing in our way, okay, the folks who don't recognize the science behind the climate crisis, the folks who don't recognize the value of a socially equitable society, they're a minority. They're a vocal minority, but they're a minority, and they've manipulated the political system in such a way that it's going to be very difficult for us to lobby Congress or vote in elections, for crying out loud. And you take a step back and you realize, well, wait a second. As I've mentioned earlier in the podcast, if we're a majority from a population standpoint, and Lord knows we're a bigger majority from an income standpoint, from a tax revenue and a disposable income standpoint. I mean, there's no question. You think that some red hat wearing guy in Enid, Oklahoma pays as much in taxes as me and you? Do you think that they pay as much in taxes as the woman who drives the crosstown bus in Manhattan, or the guy who checks in the UPS packages in my building? Not at all. But he's got two senators, and I got two senators. You know what I'm saying is that there's this calculus, there's this math that just doesn't work. And so that's one of the things that inspired me to do the Virtual Commonwealth, is that why are we waiting around for somebody's permission to do this, right? The other factor is, and I just lost my train of thought here, but
well, let me help you out with that. So there's a moment in Field of Dreams when Kevin Costner he built his baseball. He built a baseball diamond in his fields, where he makes his living. I guess his cornfields.
Yep.
And his wife, I can't remember the actress, but at some point, she's looking at Kevin Costner and is like, "Hey, how are we going to pay the bills here?" Do you ever get to a point, you're in digital advertising, very successful. Does this passion that you have for this incredible project, do you ever feel like there's a conflict with, how you make your living?
Every single day. Every single day. And one of the things that I've really tried to do, and I'm in the process of doing, because in all honesty, let's face it, a big chunk of advertising is antithetical to environmental health. It's antithetical to social equity. I feel fortunate that I work for a company. It's Horizon Media. It's the largest independent media agency in the country. They are very mindful of social equity principles. They're very mindful. Now they have to pay their bills. I'm not going to say that their entire client portfolio is sustainable. I'm not going to say that their entire client portfolio is squared away from a social equity standpoint. But I'm while I'm making my living, which allows me to do things like fund the Virtual Commonwealth, I am socializing the principles of the Virtual Commonwealth within Horizon Media, and there's a lot of receptivity to that, and I hold out hope that I can go from 0 to 60 quicker within an organization like Horizon Media than I can do by trying to reinvent the wheel at every stage of the process. So it's a great question. It's something I grapple with every day, but be assured that there are folks in senior management at Horizon Media who know what I've got going on, and they allow me to do things like talk about social equity and sustainability, and they allow me to pitch my ideas. And I think that there's a huge opportunity for media companies out there who say, listen, I know my entire client portfolio may not be the best right now, but I do have to pay the bills. But how do I roadmap my way? How do I roadmap my way from where I am right now to a sustainable portfolio of companies? And I do believe that the Virtual Commonwealth as a platform that, again, redefines the brand consumer relationship is a way that digital advertising and media companies in general can help steer the process.
And what are some of the keys that are crucial to your success? Now, it seems like to me, you have this, a brilliant idea, and you have a real. I think you'll be able to sell this, and I think people will follow if you build it. If you build it, they will come.
Right.
I think people will buy in. So I definitely think the potential here is endless. Well, what are some of the keys for you to get to where you need to go?
Well, the first thing you really need is you need first adopters, right? You need a group of people who are, for lack of a better term, the true believers, who are like, listen, I get what you're doing, and I'm going to have some patience, and I'm going to, because what I have right now, Julian, is something called an MVP, a minimal viable product, and it reflects the money that I've invested in, and some friends have invested in, and the developers have given me a discount on services, and they have a convertible note, and there's probably, all told, a little over $200,000 in the app, and most of that's mine. But we have something that's ready for testing right now. So what I really need are some people to be first adopters and test it. I think the first major barrier is when you think about it, right, is that I can't go up to a company, whether it's a public company or whether it's a private company. I can't go up to them and say, I've got 16 people who want to invest $1,400 in your company, right? We're going to have to build critical mass. We're going to have to get to the point where we've got 250,000 people, for example. I'm just picking that number out of my head and say, listen, Misfit Markets, I not only have 250,000 customers for you, but I've got 250,000 people who have put in a bucket $2 million worth of investment money. And what do you say that we strike a deal between the Virtual Commonwealth and Misfit Markets where we get equity and we get a certain kind of a customer deal, like a buying club type of thing? And so what I'm looking for really, to answer a long-winded way of answering the question, is I'm looking for first adopters. I'm looking for true believers. I'm looking for, I described to you this huge target market that we're dealing with. Mm-hmm. Well, the question isn't, is the target market big enough? The question is, what subsegment of the target market do we go after first? And that's really what I'm focused on right now. And I do think, like I said, I have this book coming out on public administration and social equity. I've just recently been to a conference on a social equity leadership conference. There's a lot of positive feedback and a lot of positive reaction to these ideas. And I do believe that by combining sustainability and social equity, that I may have identified this group of first adopters. Because, by the way, as you and I discussed the last time we talked, sustainability and social equity are inextricably linked, right? I mean, the folks that are getting hit the soonest, the hardest by the environmental catastrophe, they don't look like me, right? And there's 1,000 data points to that, right? I just cited something in the book the other day. There's a section in the Bronx where kids have 2 times the asthma rates of the city averages, is because they live next to basically a freeway where 18-wheelers are coming in back and forth. Well, those are little black and brown kids, man. And my kid has got curly blonde hair and blue eyes, and thank God, knock on wood, she doesn't have asthma. That's because I don't live in the Bronx. I live on the Upper West Side, right? So this idea that it's either or sustainability or social equity is nonsense. Everything is connected. Your liver and your lungs and your kidneys are connected, and you and I are connected, and all members of society are connected. And so when we problem solve, we're not going to problem solve for just sustainability. We're not going to problem solve for just social equity. We're going to problem solve and we're gonna throw that stone in just such a way that it hits just the right point where we can kind of shift things, and we can get things headed in the right direction.
When you told that story, it reminded me. I did a startup. I've done a couple of startups in the legal staffing industry where we provide temporary attorneys to law firms, and it's the same thing. When we first got started, we would tell the attorneys we had all this work for them, and we didn't really have any work. And then we told the law firms we had all these people to work for you, and we didn't really have them yet. So we told both that the other was going to be there, and we had to build in concert, and that's that's just how the industry is, and that's how we did.
Yeah, no, definitely. You've got it. And that's the thing, Julian. I think you touched upon something really great, and this is something, and I appreciate you giving me the opportunity to kind of articulate this, is that I'm not selling an app, and I'm not selling an investment platform. I'm selling a worldview. I'm selling a story. And in that regard, that's one of the reasons I'm so grateful for being on here, is I think it's a good story, and I think it's a story that people want to hear, because you know what, we've been at each other's throats for long enough right now. And what real leadership is articulating an ideal and detailing how we're going to get from where we are right now to that ideal. And it hasn't taken me 30 years to master the subject matter. It's taken me 30 years to be able to tell the story. And that's why I think that the timing is particularly good, and why I'm really very, I feel very positive. I mean, despite the fact that the wheels seem to be coming off the bus here, there just is a tremendous opportunity for all of us to make the right moves. And wouldn't it be nice for us to sit back 20 years from now and tell our kids, you know what, things look pretty grim around 2023. It was 110 degrees in Rome, and there's all sorts of things going wrong. There's fires in Canada, and people were trying to spin the idea that slavery was beneficial to people. And you know what, we focused on the positive, and we focused on the ideal, and we kept true to our principles, and we turned things around. And wouldn't that be wonderful?
Well, it's funny. I was having lunch with my 19-year-old son who's getting ready to start his second year at UVA. And I said to him, "Man, you're just so lucky. Good looking kid. The world is going to be your oyster. There's so many things you're going to be able to accomplish." And he looked at me and says, "Dad, you guys have screwed the world up. I mean, with the way the planet is, do we have 20 or 30 years?" And so it made me a little bit sad. So I hope that your vehicle, the Virtual Commonwealth, and others, hopefully others will follow on and do similar type of projects. Have you been able to connect with the university? Have you gotten the university involved, or have you talked to the school since you started the project?
No, I have to tell you, Julian, I was a poor student. And as you and I have discussed, I appreciated all the friends that I made at the University of Virginia. My particular experience at the University of Virginia was the things that I appreciated about my experience at the University of Virginia were not typical UVA experiences. Like, for example, I've got a bunch of my fraternity buddies. They were from New York. They were from Long Island. They were from New Jersey. They were from Pennsylvania. These weren't normal this wasn't kind of Baltimore, Richmond, good old boy network type of stuff. So I never really inserted myself into the social fabric of what I would call typical UVA. And in all honesty, I mean, aside from you're one of the only you're one of the only guys who I've kept in touch with who wasn't a fraternity brother of mine. So listen, if you've got people I can talk to from the university system, I think this is a great idea. I think the time is right. I think that we've got the story. I think that we've got the platform, we've got the product. So if there's anything that you can obviously do to facilitate that, then I'm open to any introductions that you can possibly facilitate.
Well, sure. Well, I'll definitely do my best. And I'm sure the school would embrace the idea and hopefully the success. Well, look, Todd, your website is, I believe, www.virtualcommonwealth.com. I
Yep.
believe lots of information. The white paper is on there. The app, I believe the app demo is on there, but I believe there's a video on there as well. Folks can learn more about it.
Yep.
I would
Yeah,
also-
or just totally, or just reach out to me directly. You know, I mean, that ktpooser@gmail.com. I mean, that's usually the best way for me for anybody to get in touch with me. And I'm usually neurotically checking my emails because I got a lot of things going on right here. But yeah, but please, if there's anybody who's checking this thing out and is interested, I'd be more than happy to bend their ear about it.
Exactly. And also, if you want to see more Todd, go to the Save the World dive bar tour on YouTube as well. It's a good time. Lots of great chat. So it's a great YouTube platform as well. So Todd, look, I really appreciate you taking time to talk to me. This has been great. I learned a lot. Hopefully folks will contact you and get more involved, and you can build a critical mass so you can start really building this thing.
Well, Julian, I can't tell you how much I really appreciate you taking the time to give me this platform, and love talking to you as always. And thank you so much for the opportunity.
Yeah, you're welcome, Todd. Let's keep in touch. We'll definitely we'll get together. I don't think I've seen you since in person since college.
It's been a while, man. It's been a while.
But
absolutely.
Yeah, no, it's been too long, and I think we probably would have gotten together if not for the lockdown. But we'll definitely will have to do that soon.
It sounds good. Thanks again, Julian.
Yeah, Todd. Thank you, but have a nice evening.
You too, bye.